the system is designed. I'm going to get raw with you because this is what I always tell people. I said the system is designed to keep us away from our families. So if you live in a particular environment or community, especially if you're in the city, right? We already established the last podcast. If you don't know, when we say the city, we're talking about New York City, okay? We're talking about the 5 boroughs.
Put some respect.
Predominantly Brooklyn. Okay?
I think you know where you're from. I think y'all know where you're from.
Let's go, let's go, let's grow, let's grow, let's get it, let's get it, let's get it.
We are back. We are back. Black Dad Unfiltered, Carlos V. Spencer with Coach Rod, part 2.
What's up?
Topic, raising black sons in America, how to raise black sons in America. Part 2, man. How you feeling, man? Part 1 was pretty good.
Listen, man, I'm excited from what we talked about. I'm still kind of high from that conversation we had a little while ago. Obviously, it's a topic near and dear to my heart, and it's a topic worth unpacking, right? Which is why I'm glad we decided to do this in multiple parts.
Yeah.
When we talk about raising a black son, it's so multifaceted, so multi-layered. So I'm excited to get to the second part.
For sure. So again, we're Black Dad Unfiltered. This is part 2. So go back. If you're watching this one and you didn't see the first one or didn't listen in to the first one, whether you're watching us, go back and watch the first one. It's a great topic. Part 1 was raising black sons in America, culture identity. So you can go back and watch that, or you can actually go back and listen to that if you're listening in as well. Again, this is part 2, raising black sons in America. And today we're dealing with discrimination and racism. Dealing with discrimination and racism, kind of heavy topic. So before we get too heavy, let me break up the heaviness a little bit in this unfiltered stuff. We talking about myself, Carlos V. Spencer, Coach Rod. We've known each other say over 20 years. Great friendship. And it's highly unlikely if you're in the sports world. I'm a defensive back, and Coach Rod is wide receiver. So I don't know how we did this, man.
Listen, it probably helped that I wasn't good, so I wasn't a threat. So you're like, I'll be his friend. Right? In my mind, I was sick with it. In reality,
I promise you, anybody watching this and you in the sports world or you listening to this, it's like, yo, they don't usually get along. DBs and receivers.
Listen, man, we talked last week about cultural identity and finding places where you can fit in, and I was like, this is my guy right here.
Yeah,
I rock with him. I there's something about this that feels right to me. And from there, we're talking about, was it 97? 27 years.
That's wow. That time goes fly, man. Our time flew by.
Years? Yeah. Holy shit, yeah.
This flew by, man. Flew by. Yep. So that's good times. We'll break into some of the stories, the football stories, man, the friendship stories. But like I say, even Coach Rob, man, just same thing. When I met you, man, electric. Just electric, man. The personality, the smile, you remind me of the Deion Sanders, the Chad Ochocinco, those personalities that are big and beautiful, but then you meet the person and the person is dope. I think the misconception, I'm not going to go too far down that road, but the misconception is you see this big personality. I think sometimes you think the person is going to be a certain way and they're not. So for me, that clicked. I was like, yo, this is a dope dude. And I love the personality. So man, even doing that and talking about doing Black Dad Unfiltered, one of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of it and do that with you, it was because of that, and because of watching you and seeing you with your children as well. Again, go back, watch the other one, go back and listen to the other one. You said something that was very powerful, seeing how you move with your children and seeing how you learn some things along the way to do with your children. Black Dad Unfiltered. This is part 2, raising black sons in America. And we dealing with racism and discrimination. And you touched a little bit on it with something that happened with your son before, man. But so when we're talking about raising black sons in America, we know that discrimination, we know that racism is there. A lot of people, well, some people like to say it may not be there. One thing that I often say is a great piece of advice I received from somebody is they say, read information in books, but talk to people in your family. And my grandfather, before he passed, I remember talking to my grandfather, and my grandfather drank from a black-only water fountain. My grandfather sat on the back of a bus in his uniform. So he was in the military. And so I say that to say racism ain't that far past. It's definitely still here. We unfiltered, right?
Sure.
And it ain't that long ago when it was extremely heavy. I'm going to say this, Coach Rod. I'm going to say this. We
Say
unfiltered.
it.
A lot of stuff that was happening back in the day when it was heavy, extreme racism and really up in your face. A lot of those people have had children, and a lot of those people were young and they're adults now.
So, man, listen. One of the most profound things that I realized, well, I think the civil rights movement was in the 1960s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So think about this. Anybody who's roughly 70 years old right now was born pre-civil rights, Jim
You
Crow
guys say that
era.
again. You guys say that again.
Anybody who's 70 years old right now, like once you're born in 1957, 55, 54, 53, you were born pre-civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
You were born in the Jim Crow era, or you lived through it, right? What was that picture of Jerry Jones, right? When they were trying to segregate schools and he's online watching. So I thought about this when Trump and Biden were running for president, and I'm not making any political statements. But I said, well, these people were raised to be separate from us.
Interesting.
And the most formative parts of your life is when you're younger. So, what is truly their perception? So,
That's an
when we
unfiltered
talk about,
conversation. I like what you're saying here. I
yeah,
like what you're saying in the sense of I like the freedom and the honesty that you're talking with.
I had to really start saying to myself, because I remember, and I'm going off topic, I had an employer. And when I started making the connection behind why are you like this, you were raised like this, and you're trying to unlearn this for the later part of the year. So some of your beliefs, some of the family culture, it's already embedded. But I think what we got to do now for people who are following, because again, this is all about just having candid conversations
Yeah.
and sharing nuggets whenever we can.
Yep.
We got to define racism and prejudice, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to have people, because funny enough, I didn't learn, because remember I had to learn English learn English as someone whose family immigrated here. Racism is one race feeling a level of superiority to another race,
Mm-hmm.
and in doing so creates systems, economic
Mm-hmm.
systems, that allows the superior race to benefit economically, education wise, access to opportunity. So when we start talking about racism, we're really talking about creating an infrastructure that is oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about discrimination, we're talking about a prejudice, an attitude and a behavior towards someone based on some identifying characteristics, whether it's gender, sex, and in our particular case, the color of your skin and ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about that, we're really having to unpack that and have us understand it so we can have our kids understand it.
Mm-hmm. And you said something key too. In that definition is in a position of power. Somebody who's in a position of power, who they're in a space that they can actually take advantage of another race, right?
But remember, at the crux of that is an inherent belief that you are superior.
Yeah.
Remember, 3/5 of a man, right?
But what about people who don't know what that means?
That means
That
at some point, when we talked about the voting rights, blacks were considered 3/5 of a human being.
3/5 of an actual person. That means
Right.
that you're not a whole person. You aren't considered a whole human being. You're 3/5 of a human being. So it's going to take more than one of you to make up an actual person.
Right. And what's even funnier, I never really put it in this context, but I know there's several historians who've already made this connection. You went from property to then 3/5 of a person, right? Because first we were property.
Yeah.
It's absurd. But again, going back now, bringing it back to us being fathers, and I find myself trying to have these conversations with my children in an environment where it's only my voice they hear talking about this, or to, like you said, giving them the skinny, giving them a little bit of the unfiltered truth behind the institution and the acts and behaviors and have them recognize it when it's happening to them, because prejudice is subtle. Racism, for those who know, is clear as day. For those who know, it's easy to walk around and not think twice.
So talking about racism or talking about raising black sons in America,
Mhm.
and we're talking about specifically racism, discrimination. We
Yep.
definitely know what happened. We definitely know it's still happening,
Yes.
right? And knowing that, how do you raise your black son in a space where racism and discrimination is still present, even when some will try to say it's not?
So at the heart of this, Los, it's let's look. We usually give a tip at the end, but I'm gonna start right now.
Okay.
As men, we have to learn effective communication. We have to, because our children can't see it because they grew up in our house where it's safe, sheltered, and you're free from any prejudice, and there's no institution that's looking to oppress you. But you have to be able to articulate to your children the system they're in. One of the hardest things I had to do, and again, part of the reason why we do this podcast is to be vulnerable
Mhm.
and share, and
Yeah.
hopefully we're speaking someone's life. One of the hardest questions I had to ask myself and answer was, do I take my kid out of a black community with
Mm.
the school system and move him to a private school, which is in a white community?
Mhm. Wow.
Right?
Yep.
Because now there's so many questions to that. And I had to have a conversation with my son when he was younger, explaining the the pros and cons, right? Because he couldn't understand it. I
Mhm.
said, son, where we are now, the school system is failing you.
Now, around what age was he when you were having that conversation with him? Just around about.
Man, 11, 10. Funny enough,
Yeah.
you got to have these conversations young. I'm still having it with him, and he's about to go to college.
Yeah.
He's still saying to himself, I did all this work, I got all these grades, and you telling me I can't afford to go to the school I want to go to?
Mhm.
And I'm saying, son, like, funny enough, he got into University of Miami, $93,000 a year.
Mhm. So that's an interesting dichotomy. That's a that's a part of the conversation now too, because raising a black son, right? Wanting your black son just to have the better opportunity wherever that might be for you. In what we're talking
Sure,
about for
sure.
you, you were saying making the choice or deciding to move my child from a predominantly, and particularly your son, predominantly a black school to a predominantly white school, for what you're saying, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, excuse me, is because there was some opportunities
Yeah.
in this predominantly white school, but there were some things that may come with these opportunities. So when we're talking about raising black sons, this is a real decision. This is something that we
It
face.
is. Again, I'm not. So going back to the heart of what we were saying was right, which was having to have the conversation with him because he couldn't see what I was talking about.
Okay.
He couldn't see that, son, the teachers love you, which is important, which is why I wanted to keep him.
Now, was
But
this in the school, the predominantly black school?
yes, of
Okay.
course. Right. And again, he aged out. He aged out of that school, but the options after he aged out was these schools were all under resourced.
Mhm.
All under resourced, all underperforming. And that's not indicative of the quality of people that worked in the school.
Right.
It was very clear about the economics surrounding the school, which is obviously public school. You're funded by the city
Yeah.
and your tax dollars. And then that's when I realized, okay, the system is designed. I'm going to get raw with you because this is what I always tell people. I said, the system is designed to keep us away from our families.
Mm.
So if you live in a particular environment or community, especially if you're in the city, right? We already established the last podcast. If you don't know, when we say the city, we're talking about New York City, okay?
Mhm. Mhm.
We're talking about the 5 boroughs,
Uh-oh, put some perspective.
predominantly. Brooklyn.
I think
Okay.
you know where you're from. I think I know where you're from.
But when you start thinking about it, just hear me out. I started realizing if you live in this city, to get a job, you probably have to commute an hour away from where you live, and a adequate job that can pay you. So if you're commuting an hour, and chances are to send your kids to a good school, they have to commute an hour because this is when do you have dinner?
Mhm,
My son has been waking up at 6 o'clock every morning from the time he was 7 to go to school,
mhm,
right? And then you start realizing for you to get out of this system, and we're going to talk about this on one of our other shows where we talk about the economics and entrepreneurship,
yeah.
and trying to teach us how do we control the decision making process.
Uh-huh.
But I just started realizing you're commuting an hour, you're on a train, you don't see your kids, the school's raising your children. This is all systematic, all of it.
Mhm,
And then I said, okay, but getting my children to see that was the first thing. And then getting my children to recognize, and even myself recognize the prejudice, because I live in a community where, Los, you're my friend. All my friends look like me.
mhm,
So the first time someone saw my son, and and this is when he was young, he was at some awards thing, and said, oh, wow, he must be a ridiculous athlete. At first, as a former athlete, I took it as a compliment.
mhm,
It wasn't until an hour later I was like, wait a minute, why is that the first thing you said?
mm,
And trying to teach my son, why did he say that first, son? Do you think he said that to this person, to this girl, to that person? Why?
mhm,
And we're not overthinking this. We're really trying to say to our children or trying to teach them, first understand the infrastructure and the system, right? Because to beat the game, you got to know the game.
mhm,
And then you have to understand the subtleties of how you are being profiled, how you're being uh, how people are acting with a level of prejudice against you.
mhm.
So as a black dad, if you're not aware of the micro cues, if you're not aware of the system, man, listen, I'm on a tirade now, so you might as well just get yourself a cup of coffee. We talked about it in the last show, how you grew up Black American and how I grew up Haitian, right? And we talked about the identity that comes with both. So I know growing up, there was this huge belief from Caribbeans about American Blacks, right? And I can't speak for everyone, but that we were different in terms of attitude, work ethic. And once I understood the system, I said, do you not understand that American Blacks grew up in an infrastructure that intentionally separated families, that intentionally, took away the father figure in the family, that intentionally destroyed faith-based organizations in the. So even though we're coming from another country as immigrants, we're still coming with a family intact,
Mm,
right? I'm gonna keep saying this with pride. The most dangerous thing in the world is a black family unit,
mm.
right? That has faith.
Not
Right?
dangerous. What do you mean? I know what you mean, but for those watching, those listening in,
Listen, when you talk about the ability to
yeah.
move mountains, but to get more specific, to create economic change, to provide emotional stability, to create future leaders. When you keep a family nucleus together, because we both talked about growing up with cousins and siblings and having extended brothers in the family, and
Mhm.
that's now we can say I love you to each other.
Right.
When you can keep that together, it's very powerful.
Mhm.
It's very powerful. So looking at it from a different lens, because I didn't know no better. Once I started studying, it's like, holy cow, man! Listen, I'll drop a tidbit on you. In Long Island, uh, there used to be these overpass that were deliberately built at a certain height, and Jay Z actually talks about them in his book. Uh, that buses couldn't go underneath it. Why? Because it stopped you from busing black children into the community for education.
Wow.
So when you think about this, it's powerful to understand as a black dad, hey, what is the system? Why is it important to have a vote? Why forget vote? Why is it important to be civically and community engaged?
So
I'm
a
a,
lot of what I hear you saying is
Mhm.
raising black sons in America, talking particularly about racism, discrimination,
Yeah.
that is there, and sometimes it shows up in ways that may not be evident, right? That you may not recognize at face value.
Yeah.
But as a black dad, you need to have these conversations with your black son to make your black son aware of some things that he may not know. I heard you say something. Well, go ahead. You want to say something?
Go ahead. You
I
want to
heard you say
something?
something about your son. My
Mhm.
son's a big guy, right? My 20-year-old back bigger than mine, right? Wrestled, football, the whole nine. And so to see my son, he's a pretty big stature, even as a younger man, like you said with your son. But the world is not seeing him like this. And my son's a gentle giant, right? You not super tall. We just ain't tall, right? We just, I'm sorry, son. I didn't give you that. But my son is a broad, big,
Mhm.
bigger man.
Mhm. Yeah.
Before becoming a man, he looked like that 16, 17. And so to your point of teaching based upon some things that you saw that your son may not see, I had to make sure in educating my son, and I'm going to have to do the same with my two younger sons because they're going to continue to grow up, get bigger than dad as well, that the world may see you a certain way. So it's not that you have to move in a way that that contradicts who you are, son, but you do need to know this, right? Don't walk
Absolutely.
into situations blind where you don't know that they're seeing you as a bigger black man, even though you're 16 years old in high school and you're this gentle, loving person, but the world may not see that because they're sometimes looking at you through this frame of racism and discrimination. And so you got to move knowing that. You got to move
Yeah.
in a way with a world who is moving different for you. I'm gonna say this: it's one of the unfiltered things, and it's having that talk with your son. And when I say that talk of being pulled over, and when I had that talk with my son, it was a talk of not if you get pulled over, son, but when you get pulled over.
Oh God. Sorry, man. Because it's the again. I got a son that he not trying to hear me because it is a matter of when, right? But go ahead. We could talk about that. That's we're gonna have to bring a psychologist here because I'm gonna need some coaching on that too. But go ahead.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
and to give you some background, this for me, I was a police officer. I was a police officer, New York State Trooper for 5 years. And so I pulled over cars, right? Went to burglaries, went to robberies, went to a police academy. And so I do know what it's like to be pulled over. I do want to know what it's like to pull people over as well. I do know. I'll say this. And I ain't trying to say this to bring some comfort or ease to the conversation because if it's uncomfortable, it's just uncomfortable. We've been unfiltered.
Yeah.
I do know what it's like to pull a person over and to not know who's in that vehicle. But at the same time, I have to teach my black son, who's a driver now in the vehicle, and that face value may look a certain way. I have to teach him in a world where some people do see you through a racist lens and a discriminatory lens that you're going to have to move a certain way, son, to be safe. And I
Yeah.
want you to come home. And there's certain ways where I need you to move where I'm not trying to teach you to be taken advantage of.
Mhm.
I am teaching you to be safe, and I'm teaching you something that the world may see you in a way that you may not see yourself. And that's an uncomfortable conversation for some. That's an unfiltered thing. That's something that we sometimes don't want to bring up, but it's a reality when talking about raising black sons in America and you talking about racism and discrimination.
Listen, it's so I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, right? It's layered, right? Because we have the conversations not to instill fear,
Yeah.
but to prepare them for the emotional repercussions that comes with experiencing this. I remember my son had an incident one time. And son, if you're listening to this, I'm not going to tell any more of your business after today's show, okay?
After today.
But all right, this is the last one. But I remember a teacher. It was somewhere in the cafeteria. There's a mess, and they tell a whole bunch of kids clean the mess. My son had already cleaned up whatever he had, and so he gets up to go. Teacher gets in front of him, right? My son begins to tell him, "Listen, that's not my mess." He starts yelling at my son and says, "Just sit down, sit your, whatever." My son tells me this. And I said, he was in your face. So I go to the school. So, okay, let's have this conversation. And my son's right there. Because one of the things I'm very adamant is I want my son to see his father stand up to anybody in any position to defend him. Because that's part of what your job is going to be at some point in your life. And I said to the man, do you know what my son was trying to tell you? He said, X, Y, Z. I said, no, that wasn't his mess. But you were telling him to clean up something that wasn't his. When he began to tell you what was happening, you shut him up. So basically, a white man in a position of power didn't want to hear a black man speak and exercise his power over him. Now I'm in front of you. Right? And my son had to hear me say that to someone. And by all means, again, we're not advocating division, but we're telling you the truth of our lives here. And my son had to see me have that conversation. I had to make that man aware, this is what you're doing. Now, whether you want to own that you're doing it on purpose or not, doesn't matter. I'm fully conscious of it. Now, as a black dad, what we're taught growing up is to not ruffle feathers, not to cause trouble. In a conventional home, he would have been in trouble. You got to listen to the teacher. But once you're aware, like, no, you're trying to institutionalize my son. You're trying to condition him to not speak up and accept punishment or accept it's not going to happen on my watch. And so this is what we talk about in the most subtle ways, in environments where this should be safe. It still shows up low. I don't know if you know, there's a study, and I got to quote these things because we're having authentic conversations, that in schools, I think it was like 70, I forgot, let's say 70 is the floor, 7% of teachers have an unconscious bias in favor of children that have European and Anglo-Saxon features, and that includes black teachers. So that means when your kid goes to school, 7 out of 10 teachers already are favoring kids that don't look like us. So this is why I said you got to have the conversation, because when you think about what a kid goes through every day from the time they're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, if they're constantly experiencing that, where do you think that sends them? So this is why, we got to have the conversations. We talked last week about the cultural identity and empowering them with good self-image. But this is also, it's an ugly conversation, but it's a conversation to prepare them so that they can talk with us and understand what's happening around them. Because at some point, they're responsible to guard their own hearts and own minds because they're grown adults.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. I want to kind of go back to something that you started talking on and ask you a question about a little bit.
Sure.
You talked about your son moving from a predominantly black school to a predominantly white school. Was there instances of racism that you started to see show up? Because I know you had the conversation with him beforehand. Did anything show up once he started attending this predominantly white school?
So were there instances of unconscious bias? Were there instances of prejudice? Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. Absolutely. It was a whole one. We got to talk about that too, another show. It was a whole different world.
Yeah.
Right? That emotionally we weren't equipped for. But yeah, again, there have been several incidences. I always joke, and my son, at some point he had the choice of whether to stay or go, right? Because you want to empower your children and make some big decisions. But I would say almost every year there was always an incident where we had to come in, and especially as a black man, and say, this is not cutting it. This is what I'm gonna call a spade a spade. Again, I think I was telling you again this situation with in the cafeteria, right? And I'll rehash the story for you if I haven't told it to you before. So my son is in the cafeteria. I think now he's fairly maybe freshman in high school or somewhere around 8th grade, and a teacher's coming around and there's some mess on the table. Wasn't my son's mess, but my son's with a group of kids. Hey, clean it up. My son gets up to go because he's thinking, oh, they got to clean up their mess. I'm leaving. Gets stopped. Teacher in his face, yelling at him. So my son, this is the interesting part. My son comes and said, Dad, you may get a call, I got in trouble for da 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 da. I said, okay, tell me what you got in trouble for. Well, and when he told me the story, I said, wait a minute. The teacher got in your face? He said, yeah. I said, how did you feel?
Mm-hmm.
So immediately, because again, what we're talking about is understanding the signs.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately, as a dad, as any natural dad, you're in defense mode.
Mm-hmm.
So I go to the school, bring this teacher in. Because what the school was going to try to do was try to explain to me the situation. But because I know the system we grew up in and I know what prejudice looks like, I know what discrimination looks like, especially as someone who's a first generation who's a product of immigrants. I said, let me understand this. And I told them, I'm going to paint this picture for you from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
You saw a mess. My son is getting up and leaving. When he goes to explain to you what the mess is, you stop him from talking, you berate him in front of his peers, and then you tell him sit down, right? And she's just looking at me. I said, so the way I process that is you're a white man in a position of power, and when a black man tries to speak up for himself, your job is to stop him in his tracks, right? And dehumanize him.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so you're part of the problem now because you're a system teaching my son to come home and take ownership for something that he didn't do wrong and feel like he has no chance for recourse. See, this is what racism is when the institution gives the power. And this is what prejudice is when you act on your position of power to
Mm-hmm.
oppress someone. Now, whether it was deliberate or not, I don't
Right.
care. I don't care.
Right.
What I have to train my son on is to understand there's a fine line. I don't know if this happened with you, Los. My son, they kept on having him write letters of apologies. I was like, for what? So I went to the school and I said, my son's not going to write another letter of apology because what you're asking him to do is to plead guilty and hope that the system sets him free. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not raising him that way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
he won't ever apologize. He's been instructed that I'm his legal counsel. So I'm letting you know you can't talk to him without me present.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And yes, it's coming across aggressive in this conversation we're having. But Los, this is the system. And again, for all intents and purposes, a majority of the people at school are amazing.
Yeah.
Uh, the resources, the opportunities my son has had, again, does not change the fact that you have to understand when you have to teach your children to identify when they are being discriminated, when they are being persecuted, when they are being mistreated,
Mm-hmm.
when they are looked at and as less than, they have to be made aware of this. I've had teachers tell my son who speaks Mandarin, oh, you speak well.
Mm-hmm.
What else is he expected to speak? And that's common. I've had a teacher call security on my son, thinking he's a trespasser in the school. So these are the things I keep saying. And, my son has a decision to leave or stay. But what I'm noticing, it doesn't matter in the school, in a supermarket, in a mall. This is part of his life cycle now, for lack
Mm-hmm.
of a better term.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So yeah, I'm glad you touched on a lot of good stuff. I think, and my mind goes back to originating this, and one of the statements that you said before, it bears repeating. In order to be a black dad, you've had to be a black son, right? A black man. And so raising black sons, talking about this topic, raising black sons in America, talking about racism and discrimination, right? Talking about some of the experiences that we've had, that we've gone through, and we've recognized, and knowing that that is still around. Is that saying that, okay, son, you're definitely going to deal with this? No, but it would be foolish to send a black son out into this world and ill prepared to say this stuff is never going to happen. I'd rather over prepare my son for the different things he may come up against. So for me, like I said, I was a police officer. And again, so for me, same thing. Am I saying all police officers are bad? No, I was a police officer. I worked with some troopers who were great, like they wanted the job, who did a very good job, but that doesn't mean that the other things didn't happen. Dealing with a world, so these things are real, right? To say they're real means I've dealt with things myself. I've been pulled over, Coach Rod. I've been pulled over more times than I can count.
Oh wow.
What's that?
I said, wow.
I've I've been put in the back seat of police cars. I've been searched. I've been handcuffed, sat on the curb. I've been put on the hood of a police car, frisked. I've been pulled over with me and my friends. We talking about Unfiltered, right? Teenagers. Police officer puts their hands on your chest. Why are you breathing so hard? Why is your heart beating so fast? Bro, we've been put over by police. Like, why do you think his interpretation was trying to say that we did something? So I've had guns put on me by police officer. So, I have had guns put on me and my friends by police officers when we were like 6 and 7 years old in the neighborhood.
Wow.
I've been pulled over in a car at gunpoint with my younger brother in the backseat of the car growing up. So I've had all these instances. And I say this, some people are like, oh, well, is that racist? So I never had the ticket. Now I'm not gonna go down this road because it's too far to go. But if I've never had a moving violation and I've been pulled over all these times, I mean, you do the math.
Listen, man.
What is that saying? Why do I bring that up? Because we live in a world that there is some racism that is still present. I'm not saying that all police officers, I'm not painting that broad stroke, but I'm definitely not saying it's not there. I've seen it, I've experienced it. And so therefore I do teach my black sons that. I'll say this too. You talked about speaking up for our sons. And I like that because so with my older son, there's some conversations that I have that I'm not having with my younger sons as of yet. But I do pay attention to what happens as a black father raising a black son. And so, for instance, my son's in school. You said something. You brought a stat that I'm like, wow, that 70% of teachers will see students, and that 70% of them will favor students that don't look like black children.
Yeah,
So,
favorite European features. Yep.
That favor European features. And that being said, I know I've come up and had conversations with parents of my children, and they view my children a certain way. What do I mean? Raising black sons in America. My son, I'm having a parent-teacher conference with my son over the phone with his teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, yep, grades are good. All A student, 90s in this, 98 here, 89 here. And they're going down the line. And they're saying all this stuff. Grades are all fine. And then they get to a space of, okay, but some of his behavior is acting out. I'm like, tell me more, right? And they're telling me some of the things that he's doing. And I got to say, Rod, some of the stuff that they're telling me, most of the stuff they're telling me is like the stuff that you would see a boy or a black boy do. So as a black father, I'm not immediately jumping, oh, I'm going to scold my child. Oh, why is he doing this? Oh, I can't wait to talk to him. Oh, I can't wait to discipline him about some things that are being brought up based upon the way that you're viewing my child. So you're telling me that there's no issue with his grades. You're telling me, and I'll say this. You're also telling me that, because they said this, that, yeah, when I say something to your son or ask him to correct the behavior, he does it. So you're also telling me that when you're saying something to him, he's not being irate. He's not going against the grain. He's not arguing with you. You're telling me that you're seeing some things without you telling me. And like you said earlier, Rod, without you even noticing some of the things that you're doing, you're viewing my black son a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's two sides of the coin, right? Having our kids understand and we understand. Because again, you and I won't say we old school, because there's always a generation that can say they're old school. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I did grow up in an era where don't let the teacher call my house. Right? Because the teacher had so much authority.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying, and thinking back to our last conversation, I said, you always have to have context when you think about raising your children. What's the context they're growing up in? And so we're not saying every person is bad. I'm not saying every person is bad, because you and I play football, you know what I mean? We so many different people, different places. However, the reality is still the reality. Racism is institutional. The institution itself is oppressive, right? If you go back to the foundation of it from colonization created the economics. The economics were perpetuated, right, with the transatlantic slave trade. So we're talking about a system that has been built on superiority complex. Am I making sense to you, Los?
Yeah.
So we can't hide the fact that there are certain disadvantages working against you, and you got to make your children aware that it's not a them, right? And we got to teach them how to create their own system, a la the Tyler Perry. You won't let me sit at your table, I'll make my own table.
Yeah.
Lack of a better term. But as parents, we also have to be aware, because my fear is if we don't really understand that when we talk about a system that again, is not equitable, because that's the real political key term. A system is not equitable to minorities. And then you're talking about unconscious bias, and then you have prejudice and discrimination. The psychological, and this is where Black people are suffering from mental health. So this is where we're going to go down these roads. You got to start having conversations with your kids so that, like you said it last week, and I hope people go back and listen. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build a strong man than to repair one. Right? I think you said something to that effect. This one said these conversations are important for us to understand, one, what's the system, what started the system, because that can lead to some level of empathy within ourselves, right? And then having your children understand, listen, be the best version of yourself. But when this happens, I need you to be equipped and understand what is happening around you. It will inform your decisions. And ultimately, when we're trying to raise Black sons, we're trying to raise adults that can make healthy, emotionally balanced decisions.
Right. And I think overall too, man, and you're bringing this, wrapping it up a little bit, make great conversation. We could talk about it for days. We have other topics of when it comes to raising Black sons in America that we're going to talk about some other different things as well. One of the things I've heard us say throughout and giving out advice, giving out some tips to somebody who's listening, looking for tips, looking for advice, not saying it is the answer, but it is an answer, right? Is learning and not teaching your son to walk around with a woe is me attitude, right?
Yeah.
We're not saying that you got to walk around where, oh, the world's against me, I can't do anything. I've heard her saying if somebody pushes you on the ground, they should never do that, right? But if I come 5 years later and you're still on the ground, something's a problem, right? The person shouldn't have done that, but you should have got up off the ground by now. So I am saying to do something, not teaching our Black sons to move as the woe is me, but there's no way that we can allow our Black sons to move in this world and not equip them and educate them of some things that are real. We're unfiltered here. Like that Unfiltered, we're going to talk about some things that may be uncomfortable or some people may not want to hear. And one of those things today being this racism, discrimination, it is real. And there's no way I'm going to send my Black son out into this world and not make him aware of some things that he may have to deal with. And like I said earlier, I'd rather overeducate him than undereducate him. And he deals with something that he never heard of because I felt like, oh, I don't want to tell my son that because he may not have to deal with this. No, I'd rather equip him. I'd rather let him know. I'd rather make sure that I'm teaching him from some of the experiences that I had. And I'm also teaching him some things that he may not be aware of so that he can move in this world the best way for himself. And so that he can overcome some of these things or know how to handle some of these things when they actually do happen. And like the car, not if, but when. So some things ain't a if it happens. Some things is simply when it happens. And I know as a Black father, I taught my older Black son, I will teach my younger two ones when they get a license, son, this is some stuff you're gonna have to deal with. This is the way I need you to move when you actually deal with some of these things. So man, any tips, anything you want to add to this, man, while we doing this?
Yeah, I love the fact, again, it's not if, when, it's when, because my son has already experienced the win time and time over and over, right?
Yeah.
My tip would be sit down, put a YouTube show on, and watch and learn together. Right? Communication is going to be one of the tips that I keep repeating over and over. But sometimes just watching some of these documentaries, and whether your kids want to or not, sit down and watch it and engage in conversation, right? Because we want to understand the human condition, right? If we got biblical, going back to man and Eve, we are living in the consequence of decisions of Adam and Eve. We are understanding this human condition. Watch these shows and really start to unpack, not shows, but watch movies on YouTube about Black history. Unpack it, have conversations, ask the questions why. There's a philosophy in Six Sigma, right, which is geared in business and it's about, really efficiencies. It's called the 5 whys. Keep asking why. Because when you do this and have conversations and you keep asking why, you eventually develop understanding, knowledge, hopefully wisdom, which is the application of knowledge. And then lastly, empathy. And we're raising balanced individuals. So that's just a very practical tip. Watch it. Watch, anything on Frederick Douglass. Why did he move this way? What inspired him? Would you risk your life for a group of people? Martin Luther King, why did he choose nonviolence? Why do we go to war, but we're choosing non? Because this will have your kids own their history and own the way they move in this system. Because again, if you're equipped with knowledge and wisdom, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, and I won't add too much more than that, man. It just triggered a thought when you said that, to ask these whys, to ask these questions. There's a saying, the quality of your life is based upon the quality of the questions that you ask yourself, right? And when you ask yourself these questions, you have the ability to start to find out the answers. You may not know the answers, but when you ask yourself a question, your mind is so beautiful and your mind is so powerful, it will start to search for the answers, and it will lead you to spaces, to places, and to people to start to get some of the answers to some of these questions. So I love what you said. My tidbit to that of what you said is, man, ask these questions so that you can start to come up with answers. And as Black fathers, start to give the answers to your children that you have. And of course, we're not going to be able to teach them everything, right? But give them the best that you can give them so that they'll be equipped better than you were. I think we all want better for ourselves.
You can teach them how to teach themselves, though, for sure.
You can definitely do that. Listen, man, Black Dad Unfiltered. I love the conversations that we're having. If you're watching here on us, if you're watching us on a different platform of social media, send some comments, send some questions. If you're watching and happen to be on YouTube, click the like, click the subscribe, click the share, click the notification so you can be notified when we have different videos coming up, different information. This is part 2 of raising Black sons in America. We're going to have some other parts and continue this conversation, continue this dialogue. I'm Carlos B. Spencer here with my guy, Coach Rod. We love you, man. Be blessed.
All right, folks. That's what's up.
Let's go. Let's go. Let's grow.